This is the story of a truck driver from Haiti.
People are thinking this can't go unpunished.
Yes.
Jean Claude Meus was railroaded in court, locked up in prison, and then freed after our team spent years digging up bombshells.
I love you, baby.
Act 2 was when you were freed,
Yes.
and now there's Act 3.
But Act 3 is yet to come.
And then I heard like horns beeping and going crazy horns, and my mom was screaming. The last thing I remember was her saying, "Jesus help us, we're gonna crash."
On May 11th, 2001, near the town of Wauchula, 2 girls lost their mom, Nona Moore, and their 8-year-old little sister, Lindsay. A tractor trailer tipped over and crushed their van, and Jean Claude Meus was driving that truck.
So troopers found that you were drinking that night.
No. I never drank my whole life.
They found you were doing drugs?
No.
Meus said another driver cut him off, and so he swerved and flipped. He said it was an accident, and so did Nona and Lindsay's loved ones. They begged prosecutors to let it be.
I think the community, they lost 2 precious people that they loved, and they felt like someone had to pay.
And they charged Meus with vehicular homicide because they say he must have dozed off behind the wheel.
Most definitely, he was alert.
Our team discovered volunteer firefighter Juan Otero. He was the first witness on the scene and showed up seconds after the crash.
Look how sharp that curve is. Watch that car. Okay? Dead asleep, you'd come right through here. You wouldn't have tried to make that curve.
But investigators didn't interview Otero, and the jury never heard from him.
Because you're talking about sending a man to prison for so many years on an accident.
As to the question of how Meus can negotiate sharp turns in the road in his sleep, well, the diagram in the court showed that he didn't. But our team also discovered it did not match the measurements troopers took at the scene. That diagram was flawed, and we got an accident reconstruction expert to prove it.
Their own diagram doesn't stand up to the physical evidence.
Still, an all-white jury took less than an hour to convict Jean Claude, and he got 15 years.
Somebody would step up and help me. All you can say is thank you.
Well, after a series of our team's investigations, let's just say the judge had seen enough.
I hope the example of forgiveness and consideration will lessen your bitterness and allow you to proceed with a productive life.
He overturned the conviction and freed Jean Claude Meus with time served 9 years ago.
I work, pay my bills, pay my taxes, take care of my family, go to church. I do everything to be a good citizen.
And now he's back to driving trucks, has 1 son heading to college, and a little girl just 5 months old.
So every time she look at me, she smiles. Every time.
But he may have to leave her behind and leave his son who's off to college and everything he's worked for, because there's always a catch. Meus first hit a snag in 2013 under President Obama on a trip to Haiti. Though his conviction was overturned, the feds flagged him for still having that time served on his record. And then President Trump turned up the heat.
We have some bad people in this country that have to go out. We're going to get them out.
The feds don't know his backstory. They just see time served for vehicular homicide. And you know how that looks in the Trump era.
But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
And so Jean Claude Meus, a legal permanent U.S. resident for more than 30 years, who's never had another accident, who's never been charged with any other crime, is facing a hearing to get deported.
I understand you want to keep the child molesters, the rapists, all the bad guys out, but I'm not a bad guy.
You're not a bad hombre?
No. I've been here since I was 17 years old.
By the way, his father just died.
My dad fought for this country in Vietnam.
His father died on a trip to Haiti.
I cannot go to the funeral.
And Jean Claude can't say goodbye.
I won't be able to go because of the immigration thing.
And after his deportation hearing, we may never see him again, and his little girl Jael may never even remember him.
I want to remember that I'm a hard worker. If I was in the country, I would have provided for her. And I want her to grow up to be somebody.
He's hoping, under the circumstances, a judge may vacate that time served on his record. But with backlog courts and time running out, that won't be easy.
And I want them to open their heart again if there's somebody in a high place, try to help me.
And so he leaves us, and may soon leave us for good, with a now familiar cry for help.
I want anybody that can help me to look to see what's happened in my case.
We're about to show you how Florida politicians take from the disabled. But first, meet some of the people they're taking from.
Why'd she cover you with a sheet?
She thought I was dead.
Former police officer Jim Bragg nearly died in a high-speed chase. It crushed his spine and left him brain damaged. His short-term memory is shot.
And I forget where I'm going or why, and what I'm looking for, that type of stuff.
Former Officer Bob Brown walked into an ambush.
I was responding to a call of a man harassing kids at a playground.
The gunman ripped him with bullets.
And he shoots you immediately in the hand and then here in the upper chest.
Yes, he did.
Former Officer Joe Johnson got rammed by a dump truck and on his way to get treatment.
A woman ran a stop sign doing about 50 or 60, hit me broadside. I hit a tree and flipped 3 times.
He got crushed again.
I sustained like 80, 90 fractures. My lungs were punctured. My hips were broken. My shoulders, shoulder blades, and collarbones were broken.
These are the most wounded of our wounded.
And add former Officer Jim Bonford to the list. He was sickened by toxins, and then a bad guy dragged him from a car and crushed his legs.
When I opened up the car door, he grabbed him by the shirt, put the car in the gear, and the car started moving forward.
Now his legs are in braces, and his arms can't stop shaking.
If it's at rest, it's doing it.
These are the kinds of stories that inspired Amendment 3. It gave disabled first responders living in Florida a break on their property taxes. In 2016, it passed with 84% of the vote. Then we discovered a catch.
No property tax relief at all. In fact, our taxes have gone up the last 3 years.
When we requested records from county property appraisers, we found nearly all of the disabled first responders living in Florida have been denied.
Well, I can tell you, I thought I missed something.
And Pasco appraiser Gary Joyner confirmed disabled first responders have a problem.
We had a list of 52 homeowners that had applied for it.
So 52 apply.
Yes, sir.
How many get it?
6.
That's just Pasco County. We found a couple of hundred others also injured in the line of duty. They are permanently and totally disabled according to the federal government. And now they're totally denied thanks to the Florida legislature.
That's kind of misleading, I think, in a little way to everybody.
After voters passed this tax break for disabled first responders living in Florida, the legislature and former Governor Scott disqualified most disabled first responders living in Florida.
Why would you turn around and deny me a benefit that the people of the state of Florida overwhelmingly approved?
State lawmakers unanimously passed a bill that excludes responders who were disabled while working for agencies out of state. It doesn't matter how long they've been living or paying taxes in Florida. A police officer crushed in New York, disqualified. Shot and disabled in New Jersey, disqualified. Brain damaged in South Carolina, disqualified.
And didn't even publicize it, so nobody knows.
And when we called the lawmakers, even they didn't know what they had passed.
So I was very disappointed when you told me today that anybody from New York or anywhere else cannot get the tax break.
In the flood of bills that came up for rapid-fire votes, lawmakers thought this one implemented the amendment as written on the ballot for disabled first responders living in Florida.
It wasn't clear, I think.
So you did not know this was excluding these first responders when you voted for it?
I don't believe that that's something that was discussed.
Well, Republican Senator David Simmons responded by filing a bill to lift the restrictions in the Senate. But as the filing deadline approached, House lawmakers like John Cortez had already maxed out on what they can file.
My 6 bills are gone. And I would have known, if I would have known that the Senate needed a sponsor, I would have dropped one of the bills and gladly took that one. Because that's a no-brainer. And that's our problem. We have a bad communication problem. We don't reach out to each other.
But the first responders may have caught a break when freshman lawmaker Adam Hattersley watched our last investigation.
A friend of mine sent me a link to one of the reports that you guys had done about this issue, and we started digging into it. I was frankly shocked.
Simmons, a Republican, and Hattersley, a Democrat, are now leading a bipartisan push to reverse what we exposed and give first responders the help they say they deserve.
And they deserve that protection, and it's expressly what the voters voted for. There was no stipulation that it had to be in Florida. I was disappointed that we would not only supersede the clear will of the voters in the language of the Constitution, but that we would even consider treating first responders and veterans this way. We owe them more than that. Once we are made aware of it, we have to move forward to try to fix it and do what's best for the citizens of Florida.
First, Florida polluted its water with fertilizer and leaking septic tanks. That fed explosions of cyanobacteria that turned it into poison. And scientists warned that can cause liver damage or brain damage.
You see a bloom of cyanobacteria, you don't want to go swimming in it, you don't want to eat any of the seafood in it.
We saw it sicken and kill dogs that drank from the St. Lucie River. But there's something else we cannot see that could be the scariest part of all. Dr. Mike Parsons is leading a series of experiments at Florida Gulf Coast University that may alarm you. The initial findings certainly alarmed him.
When I first saw it, I was thinking, uh-oh.
Because he found it's not just the water. The same toxins are also drifting into the air. They're moving through the wind.
I said, this is concerning because we're seeing it in the air. It means people can be exposed to toxins through the air.
It's difficult to understand that it could get to this point without any resolution.
Alex and Missy Adelot had a feeling. We first met them in the town of Stewart, where their poodle died from drinking the toxic river water. Alex joined a Florida Atlantic University study.
They did the testing. He came back positive for the cyanobacteria in his nostrils.
Around 70 people exposed to the toxic blooms joined that same study. And the initial findings, which are under review, showed they all had liver toxin in their noses.
But everybody came back positive.
They did say that everyone that was tested was positive.
And see that red blip just north of Stewart? Researchers at Ohio State University tied a cluster of the toxic blooms to a cluster of non-alcohol related liver disease in people. Which brings us back to Dr. Parsons' work.
That could be why people were experiencing non-alcoholic liver damage by breathing it in.
We know cyanobacteria produces the liver toxin microcystin and the brain toxin BMAA, which scientists have correlated with Lou Gehrig's disease. And we can generally spot explosions of cyanobacteria in water because it produces this signature blue-green slime. But scientists have not tested the air near those blooms in Florida until now.
When the cyanobacteria dries, it'll almost be like a crust. I haven't done this, but it'd be the equivalent of like just grinding it up in your fingers and it turns into a powder, and then the winds would pick up that powder. So you can see it still on the seawalls, just this like green dust.
Florida Gulf Coast partnered with Yale University for these experiments. They line these canisters with filters that simulate human lungs, then place them at different sites and pump air through them for weeks at a time.
The worst case scenario would be that a significant amount of microcystins and BMAA would be getting into the air and onto the smallest filters of our air samplers.
They placed the first sampler at a volunteer's house in Cape Coral, where you could see patchy blooms in his backyard canal, and the results made them wince.
Your test found both the liver toxin and the brain toxin here all the way down.
All the way down.
And from here it could get into your bloodstream.
Yes.
And they didn't test last summer when the blooms in the water were most intense.
A breeze came up, and apparently some of the poison got into my eye.
Last year, Deborah Moreland and her sister Teresa Anderson cleaned homes in some of the hardest hit neighborhoods in the state.
Every time we were in certain neighborhoods, you could taste the chemical in the back of your throat.
They said the water was like pea soup and green dust was all over the place.
It was on windows, it was inside properties, it was everywhere.
Teresa said she developed internal bleeding. Deborah got a lung infection.
I'm very worried about the long-term effects.
And both say they developed what appear to be neurological problems.
Very forgetful. I couldn't hold on to things. I was dropping things all the time.
So they closed their cleaning business and moved to Texas.
Thousands of dollars.
Thousands of dollars.
To get moved, and we're still sleeping on pallets on the floor because we can't afford beds.
While they worked where the blooms were most severe, Dr. Parsons says you will find the same toxins in lakes, rivers, and neighborhoods and retention ponds all across the state.
It will be in those ponds.
So he is still testing for toxins in the air and trying to figure out where and if, or to what extent, they pose a risk to people.
You know, is this a plausible risk that we need to explore more and understand better? And so far, the answer is yes.
Drive past the playgrounds and the fantasy attractions along Interstate 4, you'll find a searing reality.
Now, it doesn't look like a resort to me, not for kids, that is.
Of deserted stores, boarded up rooms, and crime.
If somebody runs up and takes somebody's cars, I've seen it right here.
D'Angelo Murray was telling us all about it when we were interrupted.
Yeah, like that. Yeah, that would have been some good footage, bro. Good footage.
By what may have been someone driving past us with a wad of cash and a gun.
Parker Florida, riding down the street, got money in their hand, probably high drugs. Down the street, I could have got shot. You could have got shot. You could have got shot.
This is the side of Florida politicians do not want you to see because they're taking the money intended to clean it up to enrich theme parks and resorts.
I walked around at nighttime, not a problem. I feel safe with the kids.
According to our government, these streets, lined with putt-putt courses, hotels, game rooms, and ice cream parlors, are the ones that need help.
It looks nice, cleanly, safe.
While these abandoned storefronts north of downtown Tampa, these streets north of the Orlando attractions do not. The government decides what and who needs help based on maps and zones politicians drew decades ago. And as communities change, for better, worse, they never updated the maps.
Most of them business closed up because of the crime.
That's how suffering neighborhoods now get left behind, while one of the largest high crime zones in the state runs through the heart of Orlando's tourist district. How would you describe it to the folks back home?
Family friendly. What else would you say?
You could take your kids here.
And that's how Florida steers millions in tax credits to fight crime, poverty, and blight into luxury department stores, luxury car dealerships, and the Universal Hotels and Resorts. After we dug into this program last year, the House Speaker told us this is abusing taxpayers and the people it's supposed to help.
It's a program that is not working.
And then the state approved another $2.6 million for the Universal Hotels and Attractions for hiring in what the state calls its high crime zone.
Do you think the city and state are mixing in some of the plot lines of the rides?
I wouldn't think so.
As a state senator, Geraldine Thompson tried to change this in the legislature for years. She says big money pushed back.
The businesses that are impacted have very effective lobbyists, have deep pockets, and so they go into a mode of maintaining the status quo.
Now, if you think steering tax credits for high crime and poverty into theme parks is a problem, and the state won't deal with it, you may think the city of Orlando could solve it.
I don't see anything that precludes the city from revisiting the boundaries and redrawing the boundaries.
But we found Orlando's mayor, Buddy Dyer, certified the high crime zone, as is, just last year. He sent records to the state, noting 72 murders in 2016 to back it up. He didn't mention the Pulse Massacre, an anomaly, accounted for most of those murders. It's more than enough to score Orlando's tourist district as the top-tier crime zone in the state, which the law defines as also exhibiting extreme levels of poverty, unemployment, and physical deterioration.
No, it doesn't sound right, but people take advantage of circumstances and incidents to justify the means to the end that they want to achieve.
We first asked Mayor Dyer for an interview on this back in May. His PR rep turned down our repeated requests. When we told her we'd note he declined an interview, She replied the media is able to attend his events for interviews, which brings us to this.
Well, probably better to do an interview once I've had some information rather than popping out of the bush and trying to do it that way.
Okay, well, we've sent you some information, we just haven't.
Okay. Before he walked away, we did ask what he'd say to tourists who may worry about the crime, poverty, and blight he certified around the resorts.
I wouldn't say that there's poverty and blight. That's not a given question, so.
And we asked him to square that with the documents he signed and submitted to the state.
The city's map shows 20 square miles of unacceptable levels of poverty and deterioration, blight, and high crime.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that.
If you get familiar with it, would you be willing to look at it and suggest changing it?
We have had crime come down every year for the last 4 or 5 years, so we think we're in a pretty good place relative to crime, and I'm not familiar with the maps or whatever you have that show all of Orlando being blighted.
To clarify, it does not show all of Orlando being blighted, because these blighted streets north of the resorts and attractions got excluded.
It's pure ignorance. Doesn't make any sense.
To which the mayor responded by claiming ignorance.
Well, it's the city's map. If you look at it, would you consider revising it if you think it doesn't accurately reflect the city's crime?
I'm just not familiar with what you're talking about.
Meanwhile, Governor Scott's administration is taking the position that high crime zones cannot be revised anyway. While the law does not prohibit updates, a spokeswoman noted it doesn't explicitly authorize them either. The bureaucrats take that to mean that crime zones are locked in place for the life of the program, even if all the crime goes away.
It's been clean so far. No complaints.
So they continue to approve millions intended for distressed neighborhoods into theme parks and resorts, while many distressed neighborhoods cannot get a dime.
But yeah, we got some really good theme parks that we can't go to, but we can pay $29.99 and go there all year. It's crazy, bro.
I think it's a little more than that.
Hey, sure.
And lawmakers like Geraldine Thompson say we are all getting burned.
Does this state law block cities from updating these zones?
It does not. It does not.
What would you tell tourists who would like to come to International Drive and the attractions, but they're scared off by all the high crime and deterioration and blight?
It doesn't exist. It's not there.
If they look up my charge, it says trafficking heroin.
When did you traffic heroin?
Never.
William Forrester is serving a sentence he did not deserve, according to state leaders, watchdogs, and even the judge who sentenced him.
I just squatted down in the corner and cried.
This 62-year-old man from Bradenton cries a lot. 16 years ago, doctors discovered he had cancer, and they cut out his lung.
Then, after that surgery, you were in a world of hurt.
I was in so much pain.
That was just the start.
Because they had to go in 2 more times. I spent almost a whole year in the hospital.
Then doctors loaded him up with pills.
I would go get my prescriptions filled, and just the methadone at that time come in jugs like this, and I would take 12 a day.
That brings us to his crime 10 years ago.
One of the prescriptions had run out, and they wouldn't refill it. It wasn't time, it was too early.
Because you took too many, ran out.
Because I took too many, and I ran out early.
He forged a prescription to carry him through until the next month.
You had forged the prescription in July.
In July, yes, sir.
When did you get a legal prescription for that same medication?
It would have been August the next month. About 3 months later, they come and arrested me. After she had continued to fill the prescriptions after that.
Under Florida law, that's drug trafficking, even though he never trafficked a pill.
I took the pills. They were for me.
So you trafficked them to yourself?
I trafficked them to myself, if you want to call it that, yes, sir. I never thought of that, yes, sir.
And under Florida law, that's a minimum of 15 years in prison. The judge called the sentence excessive, but said his hands were tied by the legislature.
That removes all the discretion from the judge, and so it doesn't let him look at the facts of the individual underlying facts of the case.
Republican State Senator Jeff Brandes says the legislature has abused justice and burned taxpayers in this way for years.
They were legislating by slogans, and you heard this 85%, 10-20 life, 3 strikes you're out. Those types of slogans kind of got into the lexicon and were easy for legislators to push forward. That is probably good marketing. It's horrible public policy because it removes all the discretion.
William Forrester is not alone. Mary Nowling is a disabled 66-year-old grandmother in a Hernando County prison. She's also serving time meant for drug kingpins.
Are you a drug kingpin?
No. No.
First, burglars broke into her home and beat her.
The guys jumped up with ski masks and gloves and guns. He grabbed me around my throat, pulled me in the house.
What did they do to you?
They took a 9mm and smashed me in the face like that.
That fueled her anxiety and depression.
And I lost my home, and I lost my mind.
You were homeless?
Mm-hmm.
Then a young man invited her to stay in his home.
We didn't have like a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship.
What do you think he was interested in offering you a place to stay?
My pain pills.
He asked her to sell her pain pills to a friend who turned out to be an informant.
All rise, come to order.
She also got 15 years. She said her judge shuddered as he gave out the sentence.
Took it right out of his hands. He went...
Like many snared for drug trafficking, she's a relatively low-level offender who is mentally ill, disabled, and poor.
They're taking mothers away from their children. They might be poor mothers. That's still better than no mother. The legislators that make these laws, they don't realize what they're doing.
Senator Brandis agrees, and he's leading a bipartisan push for reform.
So for me, it's allowing judges to have the ability to go below the mandatory minimums when the case deserves it, when justice demands it.
Conservative and progressive activists, Republicans and Democrats in the legislature want reform. And yet this year, the bill to give judges more discretion failed.
Largely they failed because there are still groups out there that want to maintain all the discretion with the prosecutors.
Meanwhile, William Forrester's judge noted we're paying more than $58 a day to keep him in prison.
So they've spent $200,000 to keep me in here for 10 years.
That's not counting his prescriptions and trips to the hospital.
And then the second time I went, I was coughing up blood.
A cancer survivor with a missing lung has a tendency to catch pneumonia.
I've seen people that have robbed banks, child molesting. I mean, some horrible crimes that get under 15 years.
Meanwhile, we're paying another $58 a day to keep Mary Nowling in prison, plus her medicine, and hundreds, if not thousands of others who fit the same profile. A state report found most of Florida's oxy and hydrocodone trafficking convictions were for the equivalent of 1 or 2 prescriptions.
So you don't have a cartel?
No. I'm not exactly sure what a cartel is.
She just wants to meet her grandkids who live too far away to visit.
I just want to hold all of them at once.
Who keeps sending her letters asking for Granny.
I would love to read to them. I would love for them to tell me, because they write in their letters, "I love you, Grandma. I miss you. I want to see you."
American companies are losing jobs to companies in China, and our federal government is helping them do it. The Florida candy factory cranks out thousands of old-fashioned mints from vintage machines that have been clicking and clanking for more than 100 years.
Our oldest KH that produces our Angel Mint dates back to 1911, and our newest of which is 1925.
Why don't you just buy new machines?
Well, the truth of the matter is we can't afford it.
This would be the story of how efficient, persistent, and passionate a businessman like Scott Grimm can be.
We're what made America great, the small mom and pops.
But this is mostly the story of how this factory and many others get set up to fail and burned by our own government.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
They did everything right and still do. They boil sugar in kettles and pour it in slabs and spin it with flavor. They press it and feed it, cut it, wrap it, then haul it off for shipping as mince and taffy.
So we were working quite heavy, and we did a lot of packing for these theme parks.
Yes, they took off by supplying and shipping candy for the major theme parks in Florida. But our government gave a sweetheart deal to China, allowing Chinese companies to mail products from 8,000 miles away for a fraction of the price American companies like Florida Candy Factory have to pay just to mail it down the street.
left us sort of out in the cold.
The theme parks took the cheaper shipping costs from China and pulled the plug on Scott. He had to cut from 25 workers down to 4.
Those were some of the hardest days that we had to go through.
And this goes far beyond the Florida candy factory. Records show the U.S. Postal Service is losing money by giving shipping discounts to our biggest economic competitor.
I'd love to hear from the politicians as to how is that possible.
Good luck with that. We tried asking President Trump. And the 8 U.S. House lawmakers in the Tampa Bay region, and Senator Marco Rubio, and Senator Bill Nelson.
What is the issue that you're talking about?
At least he asked us to explain it and told his office to get back to us, but his office never did.
You know, I don't know the answer to that.
Meanwhile, his challenger, Governor Rick Scott, ignored our question altogether.
Oh, gosh.
Politicians either don't want to talk about this or they don't even know about it.
I don't think that anyone had any clue about this.
Here at Mighty Mug, we make the most innovative coffee mug on the planet.
Jamie Smaldone is the CEO of Mighty Mug, a mug designed to not tip over. The Postal Service charges him around $6 to ship each one from his warehouse in New Jersey to customers around the nation. And 6 months ago, he discovered Chinese companies were ripping off his ads and selling knockoffs.
One that really stood out to us was one that was $5.69 with free shipping all the way from China.
As he dug into it, he discovered, as we did, the little-known agency called the Universal Postal Union. In short, we struck a deal with this postal arm of the United Nations to subsidize mail deliveries for less developed nations. And the Universal Postal Union considers China, the world's largest e-commerce market, to be less developed.
Just to put it in perspective, China is in the same basket as Cuba and Gabon and a lot of these like super primitive economic societies.
So we agreed to pay higher rates to send our products to China, crushing American exports. While the U.S. Postal Service has taken mounting losses, more than $135 million a year, subsidizing mail from other nations, particularly China, crushing American merchants.
You don't think that something so stupid could exist in our government.
Jamie says that's $6.30 for shipping a Mighty Mug from New Jersey, or $1.40 to get the knockoff from Shanghai. And when he started asking the politicians about this, he said most had no idea.
It's an insane thing, that's for sure.
While Mighty Mug, Florida Candy Factory, and so many others are paying for it.
And I've had more times than not customers call me saying that I'm ripping them off somehow because I'm charging too much for freight.
Leaving us with something American entrepreneurs thought they would never have to say in America.
We have ingenuity, we have hard workers. We just need the same opportunity, the same chance.
As China.
As China.
Well, what goes through my heart is that we're dying.
The rust and the rot, and the sprawling weeds, and the missing roofs in this once proud boomtown are a warning.
This whole thing was open.
Well, it still is.
Yes.
Hastings, Florida, or what's left of it, is a canary in the coal mine for small-town America.
Well, this one's for rent.
Yes.
How long has this been for rent?
Long as I can remember.
John Barnes remembers what Main Street used to be. Tourists pack the downtown shops while the town's farmers work the fields.
It was a typical Americana of the 50s and 60s.
They loaded their rail cars and grocery stores with giant cabbage and heaping sacks of potatoes. It turned Hastings into the potato capital of the South, among other things.
We had gambling operations here, all kind of gambling operations, and moonshine. Lots of moonshine sold here.
His neighbors may not have wanted him to tell that part, or the part about the truck stop that wasn't really a truck stop.
And the waitresses had on evening gowns and these real dangly earrings and, you know, big bouffant hairdos back in the day, rouge on their chin, and smelling of lots of perfume. And I'm 10 years old, so I'm thinking, this is the prettiest waitresses I've ever seen in a truck stop.
We'll stop him there, but we'll come back to him later for his thoughts on how this town withered.
Because we've been on life support for the longest.
We'll start with the potatoes. Most of the money poured into keeping the crops going with cheap labor. Most of the people never had much.
I didn't know that I was poor until I graduated college and started work as a social worker and saw the poverty level and realized that I was in it.
Then came the North American Free Trade Agreement.
NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations.
NAFTA flooded our supermarkets with cheap tomatoes from Mexico, so huge tomato farms in other parts of the state switched to potatoes and squeezed out the family farmers in Hastings.
In the early 1970s, you had hundreds of farmers here, and now we have tens of farmers here.
Meanwhile, folks say the town was already collapsing from within.
The railroad was the divider of our town.
On a fault line of race.
All of us lived on one side of the track. All of the white people lived on the other side.
As the civil rights movement took off, the politicians of yesteryear gerrymandered the town limits along the track so the African American neighborhoods couldn't vote.
We pay double the water bill than they do.
So you're telling me that the people who get to cast votes get better amenities?
Oh, yes. And cheaper.
And guess what happened next?
Dips,
Yeah.
potholes.
Hastings Mayor Tom Ward says that goes back to long before he took office.
When that line was drawn many years ago, that it segregated part of Hastings.
Here's an idea. Why not just, redraw the line?
Oh, I'm sure through government we could redraw the line if we felt necessary.
But the voters never felt it necessary. And John Barnes said the town withered when the feds desegregated the schools.
It was a white flight issue. The white people left Hastings.
Because they didn't want to
They didn't want to go to school with black kids.
And they later decided to close the school.
Kind of a big thing that home buyers look for, too.
It is, absolutely. It devalues the property if you don't have it.
And the kids who remained paid for it.
I rode almost 2.5 hours one way to go to school.
2.5 hours one way?
Yes, sir.
On a bus to get to school?
Yes, sir.
2.5 hours back?
Yes, sir.
5 hours a day on a school bus?
Yes, sir.
You're practically on a bus about as much as you're in a classroom.
That's right. Yes, and there were a lot of us like that.
At least the ditch never floods.
Yes, it does. Irma came up to about right here.
Did we mention the drainage problems?
I had to rip out all the sheetrock all the way around.
And the loss of the railroad?
They closed the railroad?
They dug it up.
A fire took out much of the rest, and apathy set in. People must have said, what's the point?
We lost our school, we lost all of our stores. Well, the fire did the stores, and for whatever reason, we never rebuilt.
If you're wondering where the mayor is in all of this, we found him in Tampa, cleaning ditches for a living. We met him at a diner across the street.
I've actually gone many years without any opposition at all.
And he spends 90% of his work week out of town, fixing other people's drainage problems.
How busy are you on a typical day?
Town-wise?
Yeah.
Typical day runs nice and smooth.
Biggest challenge past 6 months would be?
Not a real challenge.
Which brings us to the vote to dissolve the town's government and start over.
Yes, and that's not a bad thing.
And maybe a good lesson for a divided nation.
Well, I think the dissolving will play a major role in the revival. Though it's on life support, it still can have life breathe back in it.
To find ways to come together and never give up.
The squeaky wheel gets the water, the oil.
Oil,
Yeah.
not water.
No water.
You get the water.
I get the water, apparently.
They get the oil.
Yes, sir.